Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on today's Seed World Strategy webinar. My name is Alex Martin, and I serve as the editor for Seed World, and today I'm absolutely happy to be your host. Today's theme is talking about how is your mental health? It's a topic that has been kind of growing stronger and stronger every year, I think. And today we want to look at how people are tackling mental health, not only in the office, but also with your clients in the farmer fields. Just so you know, we will be live tweeting today's webinar. So if you'd like to join our conversation, please use the hashtag SeedWorld SW Strategy webinar to connect with us. We'd also like to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded and it's going to be made available at seedworld.com in the following days. Well, today, as you can already see, we have two fantastic speakers joining us. Shawn Brook, who you might recognize as the president of my company, Seed World Group, and Adrienne DeSutter, another familiar face in the mental health discussion. A mental health expert with the Farm State of Mind. After both Shawn and Adrienne finish speaking, we're going to host a short live Q&A. That means if you have a question for either of them, type them into the chat box at any time during the presentations, and we're going to address those at the end of the session with a live Q&A. Well, in today's webinar, we're going to talk a lot about a topic that, as I've mentioned, has been growing in discussion, especially in agriculture, and it should grow more. Mental health is something that at some point everyone struggles with to varying degrees, but especially now that COVID has taken us away from our desk, we've lost the ability to check in on our coworkers and our employees and even our customers with face-to-face visualization to kind of see how everyone's doing. So today, we're going to learn how to identify when someone's having a crisis, as well as how to mitigate stress that causes mental health issues in your daily life. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day. Shawn Brook is the president of Seed World Group. His favorite quote, "Doing the right thing is not always easy, but it is always the right thing." Shawn remains committed to this concept and knows very clearly that he's surrounded himself with a superbly talented group of colleagues at Seed World Group. With a keen focus on solutions, Shawn utilizes his more than 20 plus years of management experience across multiple private and public sector industries to help shape and share about the ag communications landscape. So thank you so much for joining us today, Shawn. I'm glad to be able to bring you into our conversation. And I figured we could just start a little easy. And I wanted to see if you would tell us a story about mental health and why it matters to agriculture that you've seen in your life. Oh, Shawn, you might be muted, so make sure to unmute yourself.
It's my first time on a video conference episode, Alex. Or no, it's my 9 millionth one. Sorry. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. I like that you're driving the boat. This is great. This is an important conversation, but up front, I just need to be impeccably clear. I'm not a mental health expert. Adrienne is a mental health expert. The reason that I like to have my hands in this conversation is because it's critical to my personal success and it's critical to our business's success on how to figure some of these pieces out. And I think having these big conversations is very important for agriculture. It's very important for the seed industry to understand some of the things that we can learn from each other. And when we think about a story, the one that rings most true to me, Alex, is I've been attempting to speak more openly about mental health. It has had an impact in my life. I unfortunately lost my wife to bipolar, and that is an incredibly close concept to my brain and my heart. And I got involved with a group called Do More Ag, and we did a presentation at a farmer-based event. And we got up in front of this large group and did our presentation. And at the end of the presentation, where it was sharing and it was connecting, and room was full of producers that in my head, they were looking at me like, why are we talking about this soft, unimportant stuff? And there's tears in their eyes, and they're touched, and they're embracing this ability to share and talk about where they're at. And then at the end of it, once we had finally collected ourselves, I was walking out, and there was an old gentleman on the hallway who, in the dictionary under crotchety old farmer, was the picture of this chap. And I mean that with love in my heart. And he's walking a beeline right at me. He's not looking at the two ladies that are with me. He's looking right at me. And I'm thinking, oh boy, here we go. He is going to give it to me something fierce. And he got to me, and before he got there, he had his hand out, and he told me that we saved his life. And we saved his life because he was going to harm himself. And once he realized that there were so many people in his corner thinking about him, having the same things kind of going on, it completely changed his perspective. And from that moment on, it was a commitment to have the conversation. Awkward? Yes. Necessary? Yes. And so I think that's the story that still waters up my eyes. But it is also what is the push on my back to make sure that we keep having this conversation, and we get to talk to brilliant women like Adrienne about how we can have that kind of impact.
I was about to start talking on mute myself, Shawn. I think that's an absolutely wonderful story to start the conversation with, Shawn. And you're correct. It can be awkward to check in on someone mentally. So maybe my next question for you, Shawn, is how do we work to make that conversation a bit more accessible, especially when we're working in a business?
Yeah, I think the word that comes to mind is we have to be brave. And we don't need to be brave long term. We need to be brave for a little piece of time. In that first moment where our brain says, I cannot ask them this, or I cannot have this conversation, or I don't know enough to have the conversation. So first thing is that we have to be brave enough that we're going to make mistakes, and that when we make mistakes with good intentions, are they actually mistakes? So being brave enough to step forward. And then the second thing, and this is probably far more important, we have to educate ourselves. And I embarrassingly didn't know enough about mental health. And I don't want anyone to have to learn about mental health the way that I learned about mental health. And there is so many great opportunities, right? There's mental health first aid that I've completed. And as you know, most everyone in our company has completed. And that awareness and education that comes from that, it feeds the bravery. So when I get braver when I have more information and more ability to have these conversations, and more confidence that I know how to handle it. So I think that with those two pieces are my biggest takeaway from continuing to have this conversation.
That makes total sense. You brought up a good point, which was in our company, people have taken this mental health first aid class. Would you mind kind of elaborating on what that was all about and what we learned during that and why it matters?
I think the biggest thing that I learned, and I think everyone has different takeaways. As we've had discussions within our organization, everyone has different takeaways because not a novel idea. Everyone has different levels of understanding. And so when they take a course like this and they can learn about what does it mean to be in crisis? What's the difference between crisis and support? And for me, one of the big takeaways was I can offer someone support, but when they're in crisis, I have to transition from offering them support to figuring out how to get them professional help. And that idea for me was a very powerful one because I didn't know where that line was. So if someone's talking about harming themselves, like that's hard for anyone to wrap their head around. And what do you do? And the temptation is to not ask those questions then if that's where you're going to end up. But the reality is there's lots of resources out there. There's lots of places that you can offer to help people to get some professional help. And you don't have to walk in there with all the answers. you have to walk in with some ideas on how to get them the professional help. So knowing those resources, understanding how to get in touch with them, that can be one of your greatest tools in your tool belt to have those conversations. I don't know if I answered your question, Alex.
I think you went enough and answered it enough for us. It's all about the resources. So what might be some of those, and Adrienne, I apologize, I'm going to ask you the same question when it comes to it, but what are some of those resources, that people should have in mind when dealing with mental health issues?
Yeah, I think that the idea is that you have to know your local resources. So, right, in every country around the world, there's national resources that are available. But I think what's more important is those local resources and understanding how to find those. So any kind of a national mental health entity would have resources listed. So in my wallet, I have a little card that has those numbers in it. If somebody would have told me 5 years ago that I would have that in my wallet, I would have told them they were crazy. But the fact that I've had that in there, I bet I've gone to it 100 times. And I honestly don't even remember them all. I just know that I'm able to hand them off in that moment to give someone an opportunity to make that happen. And sometimes it's about just giving them the information, and sometimes it's about leading them to the opportunity, right? I've had people in my car that I'm taking to a local facility that can help offer them some of that professional support, but that's crisis. And I think that the bigger conversation for most people that's a little easier piece to bite off on is, how do we support folks? How do we make it so that people don't get to crisis? And that is a preemptive opportunity to check in. So many of our tools to check in with people have been taken away right now, right? We don't get to go for lunch. We don't get to go for a beer after work. We don't get to do, or for a long time, we didn't get to do those things, but that connection still needs to happen. And all people want to hear, and by people, I mean all of us on this call and everyone else, like, we just want to know that we're not the only one. And wow, and I think I have learned well enough that those of you with 2 X chromosomes are exponentially better at it than those of us doughheads with a Y chromosome, because we haven't figured out that just offering that connection is so powerful. But when men do it for men, when men can make that connection, the power of it, I genuinely believe, is amplified.
You're doing a great job at segueing into my next question, Shawn, which is, I wanted to bring up the fact that sorry, Alex.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I'm curious. Can I ask Adrienne what her answer would be on some of those resources? I would love to hear her take on it.
Absolutely. Adrienne, please go ahead.
Hey guys. Shawn, you're doing fabulous, man. And I've got to tell you, it's interesting that you opened up with the whole idea that, she's the expert, I'm not the expert, because I'm not the expert on your stress. I'm not the expert on any one person's stress. We have to be our own experts, and that's what's really important. When I first started advocating for mental health in agriculture, it was back in 2018, and we can talk more about that, in my segment, or when you want to ask those questions personally, Alex, but there wasn't a lot of conversation happening, and I struggled with, what is my role? I have a master's degree in counseling. I was a school counselor. I'm only licensed to counsel in the school, so I'm not working one-on-one with farmers in a counseling setting at this point or anything. So it's kind of like, who am I to have these conversations? And what I've learned, partially through Do More Ag and Leslie Kelly, is that our stories that we have as farmers, as agriculturalists, as humans, is so powerful. Those messages and that connection that you're talking about, Shawn, that is the most powerful resource there is. Professional help is absolutely necessary, but we have to remember that we are the biggest resource for each other. We're the front line, we're the army for each other, and we're the ones who are going to see when something is a little off, or we're the ones who can take that step and hold someone's hand, or give them that nudge to get some additional help, or start doing some stress management techniques, or whatever it is. So that's one of my biggest messages that I like to give, is just that when we're talking about resources, local resources are important. Your farm bureaus have those. Your state extension offices have those resources. There are, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. There are actually some agriculture-specific hotlines going up in states, which, again, you can check with your farm bureaus, your extension offices, your Department of Agriculture to find out what those specific hotlines are for the state that you're in. But I think what's also important to know when it comes to resources is, again, we're not all suicidal. We don't all have depression or anxiety, but we all have mental health. And we all need to make sure that we are managing our stress. So there's also resources out there for there's at every level, whether it's hopping on to the Ag State of Mind podcast, one of my favorite podcasts to talk about because it's all about mental health and agriculture. Whether it's knowing, when you're working with farmers and it's harvest season, we're not suggesting to them to go add an hour of exercise into their day as a stress management tip, right? That's not going to work for most of them, right? Certainly not in my house. My husband's a fourth generation corn soybean farmer, and we have some cattle. And so, some of those basic things that we typically do and need, we need to make sure that even just we're relating and knowing each other and knowing when something seems off. I think that's really key when it comes to resources and what we can do to help.
Right. Excellent. Awesome. Sorry, Alex. I didn't mean to shoehorn that.
That is okay. I'll ask you one more question, Shawn, and then I'll introduce Adrienne so everyone can know a little bit more about her too, and we can get her bio done. But Shawn, so one of the segue questions I wanted to move into was COVID has really thrown everyone for a loop. I know you in particular have been frustrated by it. I've been frustrated. I think everyone's just tired and frustrated. And I think it's safe to say that everyone's mental health is starting to fray a little bit at the ends because of COVID and being in isolation and things like that. So for you running a company that is remote right now, what is your suggestion to watch out for the mental health in employees? What are some of your tactics you do to, as you mentioned, continuously check in when you can't have lunch?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the first piece I'll tell you started before COVID. And I was on an airplane flying over the Atlantic Ocean thinking, gosh, I forgot to check in. I knew someone had a big event in their life, one of our staff, our team, and I didn't check in with them before I'd left. And so then I have 7 more hours of thinking about that on the airplane. And it got me thinking, you know what I wish I had? I wish I had like a corporate mom, because my mom never misses an opportunity to check in with me, right? She knows something big is going on. She checks in with me the minute that it's done. And so I wished I had this corporate mom. And then I started thinking, my mom's retired. What if I hired my mom to be a corporate mom? And so I got off the airplane and sent off a big ream of thoughts to her. And she, as you know, Alex, is our chief morale officer at Seed World Group. And that's her job, is to check in with people. And she doesn't have an operational responsibility. She has a mental health and wellness responsibility, so that I know in my head I have someone that's thinking about that all the time. And I realize not every company can do that, but to have someone who that is one of their KPIs, someone that is responsible for checking in on a regular basis, it doesn't absolve me from it by any stretch of imagination, but it ensures that we always have one key level. So that's one of the ways that we do it. And then I think the other way is to break the company down into smaller check-in groups. Every company has their divisions or their smaller groups, and to create that internal accountability amongst each other around checking in, right? The person on your left and the person on your right, just be able to check in with them. That kind of a mentality, I think, gives everyone a trigger point. So those are the two that come to my mind, Alex.
No, that's perfect. You've never heard me make the joke, Shawn, but I said one day I'd love to have Val's job and be the chief morale officer and check in on people. It sounds like a super fun job to be able to do. with that, I'll go ahead and transition, and we are going to introduce our second speaker, who is Adrienne DeSutter. So thank you, Adrienne, for jumping in, and you've already heard a little bit from her, so you've gotten a bit of a brief preview into Adrienne's life. But to formally introduce her, Adrienne DeSutter is part of her husband's fourth generation corn and soybean farm family, as you heard. They have a small herd of cattle as well as a small herd of children. And she has a master's degree in counseling and personal experiences with farm stress. She's recognized a need for mental health advocacy in agriculture and began partnering with ag businesses and organizations to promote healthy minds and prevent farmer suicide. In addition to public speaking, she helps create and connect valuable ag mental health resources. She writes a wellness column and has been featured in articles, podcasts, and initiatives across the globe. She also encourages a community approach to keeping families healthy, and she works to break down mental health barriers and empower farmers through her social media presence. If you haven't checked her out, her Twitter is @SowHopeGrowHope. So make sure to check out her Twitter page too. But with that, Adrienne, I'm going to have you start the same way I started Shawn. And I'd like to ask, what is a story about mental health that has really impacted you and kind of driven your passion for mental health now?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah. I think the personal connection is so important when we're talking about mental health, because mental health has this taboo, this weird, we're not super comfortable still talking about it in general. But when you can tell the stories and, really understand that people are people, it really makes things easier to talk about. And I think that's, that's why I want to share a little bit about my personal story with mental health. I've always had a passion for mental health. Obviously, I'm a school counselor, was before I stayed home with my kids. And so I didn't grow up on the farm. But when I married my husband, the farmer, as they say, you marry the farmer, you marry the farm. And that's totally what happened. And ironically, our professions sort of were married as well. When in 2018, we lost a family friend to suicide. And at that time, I was sort of beforehand looking for, what's my role? How can I help in agriculture without having a background, without being an expert at anything? All I know about is mental health. And agriculture in 2018 wasn't really ready to talk about mental health, I don't think, not too prominently anyways. So when we lost our family friend to suicide, that was kind of my kick in the pants that said, somebody needs to start talking. We've got a couple people out there, and you need to be one of them. And, kind of started small, but the reason that I felt so compelled to do it was because when that suicide happened, my husband and I came home from the visitation, and, at the visitation, everyone's saying, what happened? What was it that caused this? And as a counselor, I said, not one thing happens. Suicide doesn't just happen because of one thing. That's not really how it works. It's stress, it's mental health condition, it's a buildup over time. And my husband and I were sitting in our dining room, and we've got this mirror in our dining room, and we were staring at it going, it starts with exactly what's happening in our home right now. We were, having a tough time with our marriage. We had 2 super young kids at the time, stressed all the time about everything, not really getting along because of the stress that a lot of it was, started on farm issues like work-home imbalance, right? How do you know what hours you need to be putting into the farm and what hours you need to be putting into parenting? We were isolated, disconnected from the rest of the community, really, because I wasn't working. I was living out in the country, raising my kids kind of on my own. So anyway, that was kind of our message that said, let's be proactive. Let's be preventative. Just as Shawn said, that's kind of our struggle, I think, with mental health, is that we wait until we've got an issue, or we wait until we're in crisis mode before we try to make steps to help. And it doesn't work that way. You know, when you're digging a hole and you're digging so deep with all of the things that are piling up, you can't just walk out of that hole. You know, the digger you dig, the deeper that you dig, the harder it is to get out. So at that point, we said, we're not digging any deeper. And, you know, we did several things in our own home to kind of, again, remediate the mental health issues that we were having. My husband decided to seek therapy for some of his issues, which, you know, you're describing this hard farmer. My husband's only in his mid-30s, so he's not the old guy, but he's the hard farmer. He's the one that's working all the time. That's the pull up your bootstraps. We're getting done. We're working all hours at night. That's him in a nutshell. So for him, you know, by the time we talked about maybe talking to a therapist to the time he actually saw one was 1 year. It took one full year for him to say, yes, I'm going to do it, to the time he actually picked up the phone and did it. So we recognized it was hard, and we thought because of that, we need to make sure that we're helping others, because as soon as we, just as you said, Shawn, as soon as we started talking, we wrote an article. That's how it all started. We wrote an article in Ag Mental Health, and the response was ridiculously positive. We weren't expecting that, but we had people across the state contacting us, sharing that connection, sharing those stories, talking about a neighbor or a friend or themselves. And that was the biggest statistic more than anything else. You know, we had read that farmers die by suicide and experience depression and anxiety more than other occupations. But the biggest statistic was that those first couple presentations I was giving, and I would say, raise your hand if you know a farm family who lost a farmer to suicide. And almost every hand was up, almost every time. I mean, that was the biggest statistic that really hit home for me. I can read numbers, but when I see that suicide is impacting this many people, that's when I know it's not just a number, it's us. It's us in the agricultural community, and we've got to do something about it.
Right. And that kind of brings me to my next question for you, Adrienne, which is, like you mentioned, I think you said it was 2018 when you started talking about mental health, and the farm community wasn't quite ready for it. How have you seen, it's only been 3-4 years, how have you seen mental health change over those couple of years since you've started sharing your story a bit more?
I think there's been a drastic change, really. I'm thankful so much for the leadership of Do More Ag, because I think that they're out of Canada, but even in the US, that leadership that we see when someone decides to take a stand and talk about something that's uncomfortable, that branches out, that touches people. And the more that happened, the more stories, just like Shawn's telling you, that when he gave a when they gave a presentation, they had people relating. We see that more and more and more. And I think social media has been helpful in that. When I started, again, doing this advocacy stuff, I starting off by just sharing resources and sharing statistics and things like that. And it was getting a little bit of bite. But then I started sharing stories, and people started sharing stories. And it was amazing how someone would say, I will never forget, again, a super hard guy that I never would have anticipated on Twitter wrote, I'm just letting you guys know, I had to talk to somebody today. It's okay to see a therapist. And, a while back, I think people would have gone, ooh, what's wrong? Or that's kind of icky. And we still see some of that, but on social media, there's that barrier is pulled down just a little bit. And so the number of responses, he had dozens, probably 100 responses that were saying, I support you, that were saying, me too, that were saying, that's ridiculously brave of you to say that. Maybe I'm going to go do that now too. Just the connection between those stories. And the same thing happens, whether it's on social media, whether it's every single time I've done a webinar or a presentation, I've done over 100 of them now in the last just couple of years. I always have a line when I'm done. People aren't ready to necessarily raise their hand and share with the whole group, but there's always a line. There's always people that want to come up and say, yep, that's me. Or, that was really helpful. That meant a lot to me. And those stories are, I wish I could write a book on just the stories, because that connection has made such a difference. And I think the more that we see that, the more we see the interest in the conversation growing. And I'm really proud of people like Seed World, organizations like American Farm Bureau and Farm Credit, who created Farm State of Mind, or adopted it anyway. And that leadership, again, when you have big companies like that that are willing to say, this is important, stuff to talk about. It might be awkward, but we're going to do it because we care about you and your families. That really has created a really awesome dynamic.
Yeah, of course. I think you're making Shawn happy every single time you mention telling stories instead of giving statistics. That's kind of his thing too. So, but with that, I think one of the important parts of this conversation is being able to identify maybe some signs that someone is in a crisis. So what is your recommendation of what to look out for, Adrienne, when someone is in a crisis? And Shawn, if you have anything to add, you are more than welcome to jump in as well.
Yeah, please do. I will never forget the first time I heard this, and I've heard this multiple times since, but the first time that I talked to the family of someone who died by suicide, this has been years and years ago, and initially they said, I had no idea. I wasn't expecting this. There were no signs. And months later, they came back and said, okay, now that I know what the signs were, yeah, there were a few of these on there. And so that's why we see a lot of times survivors of suicide loss really promoting that idea of watching for signs, whether that be irritability, in the way our moods are, irritability, sadness, loss of hope, feelings of worthlessness. The list goes on and on. There are a billion signs. And that's what's kind of tricky, is that because there's a long, long list and we are all very different, we can't think of it like a checklist. I think what's more important than knowing all of the very specific signs that are listed, I think what's more important is that we know each other, that we take time to know ourselves, know our own stress, and know each other. And we're looking for changes in people. When we're paying attention to ourselves, I know in our home, the biggest thing for my husband when he was ready to reach out for a therapist was he lost control. He felt like he wasn't in control of himself anymore. He was becoming a person he didn't want to be anymore. And I think, just knowing that about yourself and being able to admit that about yourself is really, really powerful. So I think more than anything, not necessarily looking for specific signs, but looking for, what's a person's normal and how have they changed? Do they still have hope? Do they still have control? Those are the things that are really, really important, and that we make sure we are vigilant. As Shawn said, it's awkward to ask people about these types of things and to look for these types of things, but we're talking about saving lives here, and so if we can save lives or just make someone's life a little easier, a little happier, that's important for us to do. We need to pay attention to that.
And I can't help but think, and so what if we're wrong? What if someone isn't having a hard time and we checked in with them and we told them how great they looked and we talked to them and we said that maybe they didn't seem exactly the way they normally are and they said, oh no, I'm great. I'm just worried about this or that. What's the worst case scenario? Someone looks at you like you care about them too much? Like, that doesn't feel like that's a big risk. So the idea of being brave enough to just jump in and have the conversation and to be able to check in with someone becomes very powerful. And if it leads to, because I think everyone's fear is that you're going to open up this big can of worms, like, oh my God, what if they actually tell me how they're feeling? My advice that I learned is the most perfect words: tell me more. So when they're going and you don't know what the heck to say, you don't know where it's going to go, and all you say when they start to peter out, tell me more. And boop, off they go again. And they start to peter out, tell me more. And boop, off they go again. And just watch them. They look like they lose 10 pounds in that exercise. And all you had to do was have a smile on your face and say, tell me more. Mm-hmm. And I think it has saved my tail feathers many a time when I don't really know what to say. It buys me that little bit of time. And often you don't even end up having to say anything. It's that somebody talked their way through it to see that there is light on the other side, that there is something else to be able to look at. Adrienne, does that, I don't know if that fits or not.
I love that you're saying this because you're taking words right out of my mouth. And I think, and you're absolutely right in a couple different things I want to bring up in response. First of all, that idea that someone says, no, I'm just fine. There's just something else going on. That's totally okay. And they might be completely honest. And you're right. We have that fear that how are we supposed to talk to somebody? If we're wrong, then they're going to look at us funny or look at us like, what, or they're kind of hokey for asking me this, right? Well, would you rather be uncomfortable in that conversation, or would you rather have the uncomfortable conversations I did when I stood in that visitation line? I mean, I think I would prefer the first, and that's what we have to ask ourselves. I know it's uncomfortable. As a counselor, I have asked young people, children, if they were considering suicide. Do you think that's not awkward ever? No, I can ask that 1,000 times and it'll still always be awkward. It'll still always be uncomfortable. But a friend of mine who lost her father-in-law to suicide said to me once, I wish people would get uncomfortable. I wish people would see how uncomfortable our lives are right now without him, and get a little bit uncomfortable so that we can make a difference, and I think it's important to follow up, because you were exactly right. Someone may just be like, no, it's fine. I'm all good. Right. But a quick story is that a friend of mine noticed a farm worker that they had, a hired hand, who was not sticking around, a little more irritable. They just felt like something was off. So she said, hey, everything okay? And he kind of grumbled, yeah, and hopped in his truck and went away. Drove away for the day, but she wasn't satisfied with that response. and it was a good thing, because the next day she asked him again. She said, I know that was, kind of awkward, but I really am concerned about you. I really do care about you. I want you to know that if there's something you need to say or something that's going on, I'm here to listen. And he broke down crying in that driveway for hours and just vented about all the different things in his life that had been stressing him out. And we never know what would have happened had she not pressed that question, And I think that is exactly what we have to do. We have to, you're right, you may not know the right thing to say, but you got to ask. National Institute of Mental Health, that's what they say. The first thing you do is you got to ask. We got to don't do nothing, right? We don't have to just wonder or wait for someone else to say something. We start off just by asking, talking about what is it that you're noticing that's different, or just sharing that you care and you feel like maybe this is a conversation you need to have. And then you listen. And Shawn, you're spot on, because when we are trained to be counselors, the first two skills they teach us is not about problem solving. It's not about, having all the solutions. It's listening. Number one, we spend a whole semester just talking about listening and how you listen for things. And the second thing is having empathy. So we're not only listening, but we're understanding that we don't have to agree with what someone is saying. We don't have to agree that someone's world really is crashing down. And, we don't see it that way necessarily. But what we're going to do is we're going to relate, and we're going to say, I may not be able to be in your shoes right now, but I can see that you are hurting. And so I want to be here with you through this. So let's talk about this. So asking, empathizing, that tell me more is exactly that. It's allowing someone to just vent. And that's really the secret to therapy, but don't tell anyone.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, Adrienne. The secret to therapy, just listening and being empathetic. I feel like that's what a lot of friendships are too, is just listening, being empathetic, and hearing people out. Well, just one more question for you, Adrienne, before we go into our live Q&A with both of you. What is your recommendation? One of the things we talked about is that stress can cause people to get down in the dumps in their mental health. So what is some of your recommendations for alleviating some of that stress to help your mental health?
That's a great question. And again, this is the tricky answer because for all of us, we are all very different. We have to know our own stress. We have to know what works for us and what doesn't work for us. If I told my crew of DeSutter farmers out there, let's do some yoga and light our essential oil candles and things like that to really reduce our stress, that probably wouldn't go very well. It really wouldn't be very well received, right? I'm not saying those things are bad. I'm just saying it's not going to work for my crew, right? And that is what's really key, is that we know what works for us and what doesn't work for us. And to take that a step back, we have to find those things. We have to be active in figuring out what does alleviate our stress. We can't, again, wait until that hole is dug too deep and then we're all stressed out going, oh, wait, I'm supposed to do heavy breathing or something, right? You know, or deep breathing. And that's not how it works. When we're in the middle of crisis, we're in that heavy stress. That's not the time to start considering stress management techniques. What we need to do is be proactive. Again, practice those things ahead of time. If whether that's daily exercise for you, I'm not talking about during harvest 30 extra minutes. I'm just saying, you know, can you hop out of the four-wheeler and walk to check your fields instead of riding everywhere? You know, just little things like that. We all have to find what works for us. And I know, you know, as a farm family, that's different than when you're working in business and maybe you have a different type of schedule. But it's really important that we acknowledge that knowing what works for us is more important than just, again, checking off a list. But I think it does start with your basics. You know, science does tell us that we need sleep, we need to eat, we need to move somehow, get that exercise, get our blood flowing. Those are all just very basic needs that we need to have that can keep our stress underway. So we have to get creative and figure out how can we fit that into our life and how can we recognize how that's going to make a difference for us.
Well, Alex, one thing that I have learned about myself is that I don't realize I'm stressed out until I get relaxed. So until I take a week of holidays, never mind a week of holidays, take a day off, that unscheduled day off that you take, and you relax and you go, oh, wow, like, I feel better. And I don't notice it at the time, which is kind of shame on me for not having easier triggers to tell me, but it's that proactively knowing I have to do these things that relax me so that I don't end up in that stressed out state.
Perfect. No, I love that both of you mentioned some things that can help alleviate that stress, and that the fact that we can get caught up not knowing that we're even stressed out. I feel like I'm the same way, Shawn. And Adrienne, you made me laugh because you mentioned yoga. I do yoga twice a week. It's not until I sit down to do it that I'm like, whoo, there goes all the stress of the day. It's just gone. But thank you both so much. So with that, we're going to start doing our Q&A. So if you have a question for Shawn or Adrienne and you haven't asked it yet, please go ahead and type it into the chat box. We'll start working to address all of them. I'm going to kick off our Q&A with a question of my own, which is silly since I've been asking all of the questions, but I wanted to ask you both. How about we start with Shawn and then move on to Adrienne? What is the biggest question you receive when it comes to mental health, and in particular, how it affects agriculture and the seed industry?
I think that the biggest question I get asked is, why me? Why can I have, or why should I even think that I can have any impact on this? But it's interesting because it's the biggest question that I get asked in agriculture about everything that relates to communications, right? We would just as soon not stand up and tell our own story. Every time I have this conversation, I think of my dad giving me kind of the two fingers in the back of the head as I was bragging to someone about goals that I scored in hockey. And then he gave me a little smack, and then him reminding me afterwards, we don't talk about ourselves. If somebody else wants to talk about us, fine, but we don't talk about ourselves like that. And that's just, I don't run into anyone in agriculture that doesn't have that humbleness bolted into them. And so with that humbleness, which of course can be very good, also gets in our way from being willing to tell our story. And telling our story is the way that people can then make a connection, because it's a lot easier to fall in behind someone who's telling their story than be that first person to stand up and tell their story. So that's the biggest question I get asked is like, why me? And unfortunately, I haven't perfected the answer. I think Adrian's going to give you a better answer, because my answer is, why not? Why not you? Why can't it be you that stands up? What does anyone else in this world have to offer more than your ability to share? So jump in and make the mistakes that all of us make, and you grow, and everyone around you grows from it. And wow, I'm not sure it gets any better than that. Adrienne, I suspect you have a better answer for her.
I'm going to be completely transparent with you that when you asked the question, I was reading the question out of the chat box. So I'm going to have you repeat it, and then I'll hop on.
Doesn't that happen to all of us? I get distracted by the chat box sometimes too.
I try to just let it go, but I was reading one that I could tell I could answer. So
perfect. So what is the biggest question you receive when it comes to mental health and agriculture?
The biggest question. I get a lot of questions. That is something as in my role.
Right.
I do get a lot of questions. I think recently, one of the most interesting questions that I have gotten is how we help support people with mental health conditions, and particularly in the home. I get a lot of spouses that say, how do I help my husband? And I'm going to say husband, not to be sexist, but because that's the question that I get, honestly. And we do know that statistically, women actually experience mental health conditions like anxiety and depression more than men do as far as the numbers go. However, suicide rates are drastically higher in males, particularly white males and particularly older white males. And that's a lot of our agriculture population is older white males. So, when we're talking about those rates of suicide being higher in farmers, that kind of aligns with that. But when we're talking about supporting them, I think we have to, my response, I guess, is typically we have to think about how we want to be supported. And a lot of times we want to tell people what to do. You need therapy, or you need to go get on medication, or, you need to figure this out, or you need to look on the bright side, or, you need to change your perspective, whatever. And we really have to stop and think about how that feels to be kind of told what we need to do. We don't like that. Nobody likes that. So I think one of the biggest things we can do to support people, again, is going back to listening and empathy. I may not understand that it's really hard for you to get out of bed right now, even though there's a lot of chores to be done. I may not understand that, but I know you don't really want to be sleeping right now. And so I'm going to try to have some empathy, try to have some understanding of that. That's a tricky response, because what I'm saying is we don't know a lot about mental health conditions when we don't have them. If I don't have depression, even as a counselor, I spent 7 years in college learning how to be a counselor. I've never been diagnosed with a mental health condition. I probably could have been, but I haven't. And so it's hard for us to relate. So when we see those things happening in our home, like someone who can't get out of bed and enjoy their children or their grandchildren, or someone who is slacking on the farm and not getting work done, it makes us really frustrated, or it makes us go, what the heck is going on? And so I guess that's what's important, is to know, like you said, Shawn, to have that education, understand what's really going on with someone in someone's brain that has a mental health condition, so that you can understand and then have empathy and work together with patients to kind of solve that thing. So I would say that's probably the question I get the most. We haven't talked a lot about stressors in general and why agriculture does see more suicides. And I do see that was a question. So I think that is a decent segue to just respond with, that's the other question. Why agriculture? What is it about us that causes these numbers to be so high? And ironically, with COVID, a lot of the world was seeing some of the stressors and experiencing some of the stressors that agriculturalists face all the time. Isolation, right? We live in the middle of the country a lot of the time. We're in rural areas a lot of the time. Whether you're a farmer or you're working in ag business, we're in predominantly rural areas. Working with family. I read that the divorce rate skyrocketed at the beginning of the pandemic. I've read some varying data on that, but I'm just not surprised because when you've got to work with your spouse, or with your children at home, that can cause a lot of stress. People don't know that. Those of us in agriculture, we know that. We work with our family. My first date with my husband was at church, and he afterwards said, yeah, that's my mom up there. That's my uncle. This is my grandparents, right? We're in a rural area. And I'm like, why is he not sitting with his family? We're at church, right? Who doesn't sit with their family? Who am I dating right now? This is weird. And he later said, Adrienne, I see my family every day, every single day. So church for me is my break. It's my personal time. Took a while for me to understand that. But again, those are the types of things, the types of stressors that farmers have that are just so unique. And to top it off, financial uncertainty. That's a huge one. I, as a counselor, was a little offended when I saw that farmers have a high stress job, one of the highest stressors, highest jobs when it comes to stress, because I was like, do you know what I do every day as a counselor? It's pretty stressful, but I still always have a paycheck. And if I get fired, I can always get another job. I can use my skill sets to do something different. And in farming, it's not always the case. Farming is an identity. It's a lifestyle. So again, I'm speaking on behalf of farmers, but I want to, make sure I expand that to the agriculture community in general and business, et cetera, because when those stressors happen to farm families, you deal with that in business as seed salesmen, that uncertainty, you deal with that volatility, you deal with all of those things and all of those people directly. So you feel that stress radiates onto you as well. So those are the questions, I guess, that I just made a very long response to that, answered a couple questions, but hopefully it got what you needed.
No, that's okay. Thanks for for answering our first audience question. So I'm going to go ahead and address our second audience question. And I'm going to take this in a standpoint of, Adrienne, if you to answer it from the US standpoint, and Shawn, you to answer it from the Canadian standpoint, that would really help out. Is there any work being done to try and address the cost barrier to mental health help? So there's a lot of talk from companies and governments saying mental health is important, but therapy is not cheap. And Shawn, y'all might not have this much of a problem in Canada, but in the US, insurance policies don't always offer as much help as you'd like for mental health. So is there any work being done to try to address that?
In the United States, yes. A couple different responses I have. Number one, because of Obamacare, all insurances are required to include mental health in their coverage. Now, that's varying degrees. Sometimes you have to have a mental health condition, and we know that therapy isn't just for people with depression or anxiety, it's for anyone. So there's definitely a piece of that when it comes to insurance companies. My personal experiences, I can tell you that if you self-pay, rates are drastically lower. I actually found a therapist for myself recently who I think she charged $60 for 45 minutes or something like that. So the rates, if you kind of search around, are a little different. And because of COVID, a lot more therapists now are offering telehealth. So you have more options now, no matter where you're at in rural America or, across the country, you do have a few more options to shop around a little bit that way. Specifically in agriculture, as I said, there's hotlines now that are coming up. A lot of states, we do have some, the farmers, I'm going to botch this, Farmers and Ranchers Stress Assistance Network. This is government money, grant money that Department of Agriculture's across the country can give out. And so a lot of people are using, or organizations are using that grant money to provide therapy to their agriculture families at little to no cost. So there definitely are some resources out there that are cost friendly.
Perfect. And Shawn from Canada, tell us what the Canadian mental health cost is like. Oh, you're muted again, Shawn.
I'm not sure I'm completely equipped to tell you exactly how it works. Of course, it's very different. It's public health care, so there is a large variety of options available to people. But my answer is going to be slightly different, because what we're seeing companies getting involved, and we're seeing companies participate in funding projects and events at a higher level than I think anyone could ever imagine. To the point where it is now, we do a lot of sales training with organizations. And part of the sales training that we're doing with seed sales reps now is how do they check in on mental health as a service to their clients. And I think that as companies take that on and see it as a service that they can offer, then the delivery of that just continues to grow. So that's in both countries. It's actually even more, probably we participate in more of it in the US than we do in Canada, of companies that are willing to, again, be brave enough to risk that, to help to train this is a massive boots on the ground force that impacts and connects with producers on an ongoing and constant basis. And now they are equipped with tools to be able to do some of this within our industry, which I think is spectacular.
That's fantastic. That is absolutely fantastic to hear, Shawn. I was unaware of that. So that is great to hear on the flip side that seed companies are looking to offer that as an add-on of service to their customers, because I think that's absolutely important. We're running a little short on time, but I think we have enough time to answer our last audience question, which is, I'm going to direct this to Adrienne and Shawn. If you have anything else to add to it, you certainly can, but I think this is an Adrienne question. What about, we've been focused on stable families, people who live in the US. What about these seasonal workers, like the H-2A workers, the migrant farm workers, the ranch hands, the farm managers? They want to know if even 50% of people who work in agriculture have health insurance that isn't considered catastrophic coverage. So any insight there?
Yeah, and I'm with you, Shawn, in that I'm not necessarily an expert on health insurance by any means, but I can go back and say, again, you don't have to even have health insurance to see a therapist at all. So that self-pay option is one thing. There are, all over in the United States anyway, we have different organizations like a health department that offers mental health services. If you have a crisis, actually, now this isn't a preventative feature, obviously, but if you have a crisis and you go to an emergency room, and if you're, suspected of or talk about hurting yourself, then they can put you in a behavioral health center unit. And in all the hospital systems, it's one of those things where they can't refuse that service for you. So again, I don't know all the nitty gritty on that, but I do know that that's one thing to look into. And again, hotlines are free. So hotlines, a lot of times what those hotlines will do is provide you with your local resources. If you can't afford therapy, if that is something you haven't found, there again is so much else out there when it comes to podcasts, when it comes to just learning, just Googling even and looking for reputable sources online to learn stress management tips and things like that. So there's a lot out there that I know in our area, for example, there's a mental health alliance here that all their job is to provide different resources and provide support. So there's a lot of people out there, a lot of churches, a lot of clergy, and organizations like that as well that are willing to lend a hand. Now, again, that does not replace professional help. I want to be very clear about that, we're not doctors, we're not all therapists, we're not all psychologists, et cetera. So some people really need that. But I will tell you, the majority of people don't necessarily need that degree of help. The majority of people just need to know their stress and to feel connected, to feel understood. And I think that's a lot of where our mental health struggles is when we don't feel understood, we feel alone, we feel isolated in our issues. And when we find people that can support us and listen to us and empathize with us, sometimes that's all you need.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. I lied. I'm going to ask y'all both one more question because I think it's important and I'm mad I didn't think about it. from PS asked if there are any mental health first aid training available that you both recommend. Anything that our lovely audience should be aware of if they want to get mental health first aid training.
I'll hop in and just say, as Shawn mentioned, mental health first aid is wonderful. There is also an assist program that is about suicide prevention, suicide training. There is QPR, question, persuade, refer, I believe, training. There, I think, is one called Safe Talk. So there's all sorts of different trainings. American Farm Bureau partnered also with Farm Credit to create, help create and promote what's called rural resilience. And so they have a really awesome online training as well that's specific to agriculture. So you're going to learn some of those same things you learned in the other programs, but you're going to learn more about how you can apply them to conversations in agriculture. What I think is really neat also is that we are seeing some of those programs now designed for our mental health providers. I know the University of Illinois Extension is now, they're creating a program for providers so that counselors and doctors can better understand the needs of rural Americans and agriculturalists across the globe. So I think, again, that is a huge push in the right direction for creating that connection and that empathy and understanding.
Shawn, anything else to add?
Well, at risk of being the quarterback that calls his own number, the one thing that I will make clear is that Seed World Group does that, especially as it relates to boots on the ground training internally and externally for seed companies and companies that serve seed companies. So there is that service available that we can build, and there is a plan in place to be able to do that training internally and externally.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone. That is all the time we have today. So I'd like to give a big shout out and thank you to both Shawn and Adrienne one last time for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who participated and sent us in some questions. We hope that you found this information of value, and hopefully you can go back and give this a listen whenever you have some questions about mental health. And just a reminder, if you would like to go back and re-listen to this webinar, a recording of this webinar is going to be made available within the next 2 days at seedworld.com. Thank you again, everyone, and we hope you have an absolutely terrific day. This is Alex Martin signing off. Bye-bye.